Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're here with a very special guest with a fantastic show for you, Bill Flaps Flanagan. Can you tell us what you have in store for us today, Bill?
Yes, I'd like to welcome you all to the Antelope Valley, which I sometimes refer to as the Kitty Hawk of the Jet Age. We're standing right here at Blackbird Air Park in Palmdale. We're standing in front of two of the world's fastest airplanes, the A-12 Blackbird and the SR-71 Blackbird. This is the only place on Earth, I might add, where you can actually stand here and see both of these Mach 3 cruise aircraft together. We're going to take you on a tour of the Blackbird Air Park. Then after we finish with that, we're going to drive up the road about 30 miles to Edwards Air Force Base. There we're going to visit the Air Force Flight Test Center Museum and show you what they have up there. In addition, we're going to go to the NASA facility, which is also located at Edwards Air Force Base, and they'll show you some of the research work that NASA has done here in Southern California throughout the years.
Well, I'm going to have you do a little up close and personal with these planes.
Very good. Glad to do it. I'm standing in front of a Lockheed U-2. This was an aircraft that was commissioned by the Central Intelligence Agency in the mid-1950s to overfly the Soviet Union in order to get pictures of what was going on inside Russia. Its means of defense was it flew extremely high at 70,000 feet, relying basically on its altitude to evade the defenses. In order to get that high, Lockheed came up with a design which was basically a glider with a jet engine. In order to save weight so that the airplane could get to a very high altitude, they came up with a rather unique landing gear. The wings actually had what looked like training wheels, which they were called pogos by Lockheed and by the pilots that flew it, that fell off once the airplane actually left the runway.
And so you get up on the active and you push the power up to about 80%. That's all that one wheel and one brake can take. You check the instruments, that's the last time you're going to look inside. You cob the power to full military, and the airplane starts rolling, and the little training wheels fall out of those wings at 5 knots, and the wings start to fly. You're airborne in 300 feet, and you've got to pull the nose up to slow it down, or it'll tear the wings off. So you pull it up to about 80 degrees nose high to slow it down to 160 knots on the climb, and you'll pass through 10,000 feet by the end of the runway. At about 55,000 feet, you start to gently push the nose over, and as soon as she levels off, you hook on the autopilot, and then she gets into a cruise climb mode where she burns the fuel off and climbs up to the maximum altitude.
Then when the plane came back to land, the pilot had to land on the remaining bicycle-type landing gear that's under the main fuselage. This is a bit of a balancing act, which anybody who has basically ridden a bicycle and then found it difficult to balance as they slowed up will indicate.
And when we come into land, all the way down final, I'm constantly transferring fuel back and forth, trying to level the airplane out for landing, because we're going to land on one wheel, that center line wheel, and it's like a tightrope walker. You've got your arms out and you're trying to keep those wings off the ground, because if the wing drops down while you're in landing roll, it'll ground loop the airplane, and it can twist the fuselage right there where that one strut is. So you've got to land with those wings perfectly balanced.
The U-2, even though it no longer flies over Russia because missiles are a lot better today than they were in the 1950s, the U-2 is still in service today, over 50 years after it first flew. The U-2's biggest claim to fame, of course, was when one of them was shot down over the Soviet Union in May of 1960. And Francis Gary Powers, the pilot of the airplane, was basically captured, put in a Soviet prison, but then released later on. In fact, he actually worked as a U-2 test pilot for Lockheed for several years afterwards. The particular U-2 we have here is kind of a unique airplane. It is one of the early model U-2s, but it actually has a second operator in it. The second man is seated behind the pilot, and he's seated where the camera was in the spy planes that flew over Russia. This particular U-2 had infrared detection gear that was mounted on top of the fuselage right behind the pilot, and it was operated by the second guy. It was used to monitor missile launches out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in order to prepare for some later satellite experiments. So this airplane, even though it's painted black, in reality, during its operational career, it flew out of Edwards for the most part, and most of the time it was actually painted silver. The bubbles you see, actually, remember this is 1954. There was no GPS or anything like that. And the U-2 pilot was flying over the Soviet Union all by his lonesome and had to navigate by himself. The bubble on top of the cockpit is actually a star tracker, which he used to take celestial shots. The bubble on the bottom of the cockpit is a drift meter that he used to measure the ground speed. And in addition, he could look to see if there were clouds below him when he's flying over the target area, so he'd know whether or not he was going to be able to get the shots he desired of the target. Behind me you see what replaced the U-2 as a spy plane. By 1959 it was already known that the Russians could shoot down, probably eventually shoot down a U-2. Therefore a replacement was ordered. An airplane that not only could fly at 85,000 instead of 70,000 feet, but also could travel at 2,000 miles an hour instead of the U-2's 400 miles an hour. So as a result, they'd already started in 1959 before the U-2 was shot down to come up with a replacement. Just as the Air Force ordered U-2s after the CIA originally said they wanted to buy some, similarly the Air Force said, well, we want to buy a two-seat version of your single-seat A-12 spy plane. The one on your left is the single-seat A-12 SR-71. The one on the right is the actual Air Force SR-71, which is a two-seater, which is the airplane that most people are familiar with. The single-seat A-12s actually entered service, flew operational missions for about 2 years, and were retired without the public ever knowing that there was a single-seat Blackbird. The airplanes are interesting. The airplane is 107.5 feet long. Almost all of the airplane after the cockpit is a flying fuel tank, because in order to travel at 85,000 feet at 2,000 miles an hour, you need an awful lot of gas. So as a result, the airplanes could carry on the order of 80,000 pounds, which is basically around 14,000 gallons of fuel. It'd go through that fuel actually in about an hour and a half. But while doing that, it traveled at cruised at over 2,000 miles an hour, or better than 30 miles a minute, actually closer to 35 miles a minute. So the airplanes, in order to achieve these goals, were masterpieces of aeronautical technology. And the thing to remember is they were built back in the 1960s when engineers used slide rules, when a computer was something that occupied a room the size of a school classroom, and yet they were able to build in the 1960s a fleet of 50 airplanes that could cruise at speeds of over 2,000 miles an hour. Even the Concorde couldn't get going that fast. Standing in front of an SR-71, the Air Force two-seat version of the Blackbird. I might mention that I flew in the back seat of one of these for 5 years, flying out of Palmdale here. I'm standing in front of the pitot boom for the SR-71, which is rather odd looking compared to other airplanes. Part of the reason for that is that this airplane cruised at 3 times the speed of sound. There were shock waves attached to the entire vehicle, and we had to come up with a fairly exotic air data system. A pitot boom is basically the airspeed indicator, sort of like the speedometer on an airplane, but since our wheels aren't going around, we measure air pressure in order to see how fast we're flying. When there are shock waves attached to this, it gets a little bit tricky. For those of you who watched shuttles land out at Edwards, you know it's the double sonic boom. Well, whenever an air vehicle is traveling faster than the speed of sound, you have shock waves attached to it, usually at this pitot boom. So that's one reason, because we flew at Mach 3 all the time, basically, we had to come up with an unusual design. The A12 single seat version was very similar in terms of the speed and altitude. Actually, the single seat version could fly slightly higher and slightly faster than the two-seat SR-71 because it was lighter. It was similar to the U-2 in the sense behind the pilot there was a large bay where you could put the camera. In the SR-71, that's where they put the second guy. But basically the airplanes are very similar, had to face the same problems of cruising at Mach 3. The airplanes are absolutely unique in the sense that they are made of titanium. The reason for that is by cruising at Mach 3, the skin temperature of the airplane is heated to over 600 degrees. Back around the engines, which I'll go into later, the temperature is over 1,000 degrees. So that's why they had to make the airplane out of titanium rather than aluminum. I'm standing in front of the left engine nacelle, the SR-71. This basically is the secret of how the airplane was able to cruise at Mach 3. I'll show you the turbojet engine inside this nacelle in a minute, but you'll notice that basically this engine nacelle is almost as big as a jet fighter fuselage. The trick is that when you're traveling at Mach 3, you have to slow the air down to subsonic before it gets to the turbojet engine. So we have a very complicated inboard nacelle, inner workings inside the nacelle that sets up a system of shock waves inside the inlet in order to slow the air down to subsonic speeds. When it does that, it actually increases the pressure in the inlet to the point where, in addition to the jet engine pushing the airplane, the nacelle actually pulls the airplane because of the big pressure buildup inside the nacelle. So as a result, you are basically flying a balancing act at 2,000 miles an hour where the turbojet engine is pushing, but in addition, the inlet through a system of shock waves is also pulling the airplane. It's quite a balancing act. Sometimes the balancing act didn't work that well, and you actually had problems. When I was flying the airplane, actually, we had a number of what we call inlet unstarts when the shock waves get out of position. In fact, I have several minutes of supersonic glider time when both of the nacelles unstarted and both of the engines quit. So actually, we started at about 65,000 feet. And we finally got one of the engines started, but by the time we did, we were looking up at the top of Mount Whitney and wondering whether or not we were going to have to finally use our ejection seats. But nevertheless, we didn't. I've never had to use an ejection seat, and I want to keep it that way. But the other thing about this vehicle is because of the complexity of the inlet and nacelle, the airplane really required an awful lot of attention. When you're flying at over 30 miles a minute and you're kind of watching your instruments very carefully to make sure that the inlets are acting properly, it gets to be quite a workload. And of course, we're also wearing a pressure suit, a space suit, because the airplane, when you're flying the airplane at 85,000 feet, you're basically flying above 95% of the Earth's atmosphere. We wore a spacesuit which normally was deflated, but nevertheless, if something went wrong, your spacesuit would inflate in order to keep you alive till you could get down to a lower altitude and figure out what the problem was. I'm standing next to a Pratt & Whitney J58 turbojet. When this airplane was built in the early 1960s, this was literally the world's most powerful turbojet, even though most people didn't know about it. The secret to this engine is, unlike most afterburning turbojets, this is made of materials such that there is no time limit on how long you can run the engine in afterburner. I'll show you what an afterburner looks like from the back, but an engine gets very hot when an afterburner is engaged. Most engines, you cannot leave it in an afterburner for more than several minutes because it'll melt the engine. This engine will run in afterburner forever. It'll be it reaches temperatures of well over 1,000 degrees. So as a result, it had to be made of special metals. Just as the airplane was made out of titanium to withstand 600 degrees, this one is made out of more exotic alloys, some of which were also used in the Mercury spacecraft to help it survive the heat of re-entry. You'll notice how it seems to gleam in the sunlight. One of the reasons for that is in order to try and get rid of some of the heat of the engine, a lot of the fuel lines, etc., were actually gold plated. Now, the reason for that is gold really does a good job of emitting heat away from it. And since the engine is already so hot, any excess temperatures you can get rid of, you're ahead of. If any of you are thinking of trying to melt this engine down, there's less than an ounce of gold in the entire engine. So I don't think you're really going to get much money for it, and the guards around here probably would not appreciate it. This is the, you might say, the business end of the turbojet engine. This is the afterburner section. Most jet engines have a lot of soot back here, but this engine runs so hot it actually burns carbon. So it's like a self-cleaning oven that's self-cleaning all the time. In addition, there's actually a ceramic coating on the metal in order to further protect it because it gets so hot back here. On a night takeoff with the SR-71, it was really a sight to behold because the flames coming out of this engine were about 20 feet long, and you had like 13 shock diamonds that gave an illustration of the Mach number at which the jet exhaust was going. So it was a pretty spectacular sight. I'm standing in front of the F-117 Nighthawk, known to most people as the stealth fighter. This was actually developed in the mid-1970s and was the first military aircraft, as opposed to spy plane, that was designed to be stealthy. But it was slightly different. It was designed to be stealthy not only against radar, but also to be stealthy against infrared missiles and infrared seeker devices. So as a result, they came up with a very strange looking airplane. The first thing you'll notice is when you look at the nose of the airplane, it has some rather odd looking pitot booms. Just as the A-12 had a pitot boom for airspeed indicator, this actually has 4 of them for its flight control system. Rather than being simple cylinders, they're actually flattened in order to give a lower radar cross section, which gives you an idea of how stealthy this airplane really is. When you look at the cockpit and you look at the fuselage, you'll notice that it has a lot of strange flat shapes. Those were designed to deflect radar waves that hit it. Instead of going right back to the radar antenna, they'd be bouncing off in different directions, so the radar antenna would receive nothing. In addition, the airplane was coated with radar absorbent material called RAM, which absorbed further radiation that might have gone back to the radar antenna. You'll notice the inlet here, which has what looks like grill work over it. And basically that grill work was designed so that radar waves could not go down the inlet and bounce off the turbojet engine inside, because that produces a big radar signature of itself. But by having this grating up here, this basically denied radar waves from hitting the turbojet engine. Underneath the cockpit windows, and you notice the cockpit is shaped very strangely, again, because in order to deflect radar beams in different directions, you'll see a little what looks like a window. The F-117 did not have a radar. It basically used infrared heat-seeking cameras in order to be able to detect a target. So that way, it did not have its own radar transmitting, which could be detected by someone else. There is an additional heat-seeking camera on the underside of the airplane, and again, you cannot see it too well, but on the belly of the airplane there were 2 large weapons bays, bomb bays, each one of which carried a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb. So the F-117, when attacking a target, and it attacked usually only at night, which is why it's painted black, basically the pilot would find the target with his heat-seeking camera, put a laser spot on the target, press a button, the weapon bay doors would open very quickly, you'd drop the bomb, the weapon bay doors would close quickly so that the airplane would remain stealthy, and then the pilot would keep the laser beam on the target, and the laser-guided bomb would follow it into impact. We're standing at the rear of the F-117 stealth fighter, and this is just an illustration of the fact that this airplane was designed to be stealthy not only to radar but also to infrared. This white area actually masks the jet exhaust. Unlike the J-58 turbojet engine, which is a huge pipe with flames coming out the rear, the jet exhaust actually came out of a rectangular slot out the back of the F-117. As you can see from this angle, it's almost impossible to see, and an infrared guided missile would have exactly the same problem. So that's an illustration of the fact that this airplane is designed to be stealthy in many ways. I'm standing in front of the rest of the spy plane story. This is a Lockheed D-21 drone. Actually, you'll notice a resemblance to the Blackbirds. You might say this is a single engine drone version of the Blackbird. It was designed to cruise actually a bit faster than the Blackbirds at about almost 2,500 miles per hour. It actually is powered by a ramjet rather than a turbojet, which meant basically it had to be going on the order of over 700 miles an hour before the engine would start. Originally, this airplane was designed to be launched from the back of a two-seat A-12, which would take it up to Mach 2.6 or so and then release it. Unfortunately, they did have some successful releases, but unfortunately on the fourth one, the drone collided with the carrier aircraft, and the carrier aircraft was lost, with the backseater drowning in the Pacific. So basically what they did was that rather than launch it off the back of a Blackbird, they mounted it on top of a rocket booster and dropped it from under the wing of a B-52. In May 1960, after Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, the United States promised we would never again send a manned spy aircraft over Russia. No one said anything about unmanned. So this was a Mach 3.5 spy drone. It actually was never launched over Russia. It did fly several operational missions over China. It would basically be launched from a carrier aircraft in international airspace. It would penetrate the hostile area, flying at altitudes up to 90,000 feet at speeds up to 2,500 miles per hour. It would then exit the denied airspace, come out over the Pacific, turn on a radar beacon saying, "Here I am, here I am." It would then drop a hatch out of the belly that contained the camera, the film, and the navigation system, which was also fairly expensive. A parachute would open, and then a C-130 waiting below would basically snag the parachute with a trapeze and reel it inside the C-130. This mission actually worked several times, and they actually were able to get pictures back from China. But by the time they did that, satellites basically could do the same picture, so the program was canceled before all the drones were expended. Because after it had launched, after it had dropped the parachute, the drone would blow itself up. So this is one of the survivors. It never went on its kamikaze one-way mission, and so we're glad to have it in the museum today. This is basically, I'm standing in front of a J-57 turbojet. This particular engine actually came from our U-2 over there. It gives you an idea of what the turbojet of the mid-1950s was like. This provided on the order of 10,000 pounds of thrust, and was representative of the engine that was, for instance, in the first Boeing 707. As you can see, it's fairly small, not awfully sophisticated. It just gives you an idea that this was adequate for the U-2, but in order to drive anything as big as the SR-71, as high, as fast as it went, you needed an engine of considerably more sophistication, which is the J-58. This is the exhaust section of the J-57. For those of you who are not familiar with turbojet engines, there's a compressor section up front that compresses the air, sends it into combustion chambers where it basically detonates. And then as the exhaust comes out the back, it spins these turbines, which are connected to the compressors up front. So that's the way a turbojet engine works. And this is the front end of the J57 with the compressor blades. You can see up here, there are multiple stages of the compressors, which are what you use in order to compress the air before you send it into the combustion chambers. Someone once described the J58 engine with the SR71 that at Mach 3, it was the equivalent of something like 100,000 persons all taking a breath at once as to how much air went into the J58. This is on a slightly smaller scale. We're here in the Blackbird Air Park Museum, which, by the way, is a nice place to get in out of the sun when the museum is open. But it's got pictures of the airplanes here, a U-2 canopy, a radar antenna, a tire over there from the SR-71, kind of a unique tire. It was inflated to 425 psi with nitrogen, had 24 plies, but only would last for 25 landings because our takeoff speed was close to 250 miles an hour. Over in the corner there, you'll see an ejection seat. That is an Lockheed-built ejection seat that both the U-2 and the SR-71 crews used. Sitting next to the seat is what we called a suit cooler. When we wore a pressure suit and were not actually connected to an air conditioning system in the airplane, the suit could get extremely hot. So you were hooked up to this little suit cooler, which had a small quantity of liquid oxygen, which basically was a portable air conditioner, so to speak. Next to the ejection seat actually is also one of the several wind tunnel models of the Blackbird that we have. Before the airplane was actually built, of course, they built models of the design and tested them in wind tunnels. The models are made out of stainless steel. They weigh well over 100 pounds, so it's not the sort of thing that you would take home and put on your mantelpiece. We're running some home movie videos, so to speak, that I took back in the 1980s when I flew the SR-71. Before we flew the airplane, we'd put on our pressure suits, and then the life support technicians would actually check to make sure that we were properly zipped up and the seals were in place. If, when the suit inflated, you did not have the suit properly buttoned up, then there is a chance you could lose pressure inside the pressure suit. Our time of useful consciousness at, say, 80,000 feet, time of useful consciousness was about 10 seconds, and you'd be dead in a minute and a half. So as a result, the pressure suit was quite important. You notice him cinching the strap down because when the suit inflates, it tends to raise the helmet up to the point where your nose may be on the rim. So as a result, we had a lanyard that we tightened down when we actually sat down so that that would not happen. During my 5 years of flying the airplane, twice above 65,000 feet, I had the suit inflate properly, so I'd be dead twice if the suit had not worked properly. The suit weighs on the order of 25 to 30 pounds, including the helmet. We were told that it cost on the order of $150,000 per suit. Each of us generally had 2 suits, so in case one of them checked out bad during this procedure, we could use our backup. That's B.C. Thomas. I'm shooting the video. That shows how the suit actually is semi-rigid. It's 3.5 pounds per square inch. So that shows the suit up. That's our T-38 chase aircraft. We're getting ready to go up on a mission. Actually, in this case, I was in the back seat of the T-38 filming. That's the SR-71. They've installed the crew in the cockpit. One of our flight test engineers is making the last checks before we close the canopy and we start to get ready for the mission. It's toward dusk in the Antelope Valley because we were doing a test that required us to fly in dusk conditions and night conditions. So we did what usually we would take off about 8 o'clock in the morning, but this was a very rare about 7 p.m. thing, and it produced some quite interesting shots because, as I described, the J58 in the dark produces quite a view. So there's the SR-71 taxiing as darkness is starting to fall. The airplane's 107.5 feet long, which is as big as a small jetliner, basically. It's kind of amazing when you look at that. I flew the B-2 for 9 years, and people said, "Isn't this the coolest looking airplane you've ever flown?" And I said, "You got to remember that I flew the SR-71. That looked like a spaceship." So this is the view from the T-38 as we're getting ready to take off. We've just taken off. We're coming around, circling around to join up with the SR-71 as it takes off from the runway here at Palmdale. As I said, I flew here and flight tested Palmdale for 5 years, 1980 through 1985. So this shot is looking forward over the pilot's head, and those two bright lights are the J-58 engine plumes, as you'll see as we join up. People would sometimes mistake the airplane at night for a comet. I said comets don't really move quite that fast, but it's pretty spectacular when you see it. Coming out of Afterburner. If we accelerated directly to Mach 3.2, it would take us generally about 20 some odd minutes and 250 miles in order to reach Mach 3.2. Once we're up there, of course, we're traveling at over 30 miles a minute, so per mileage is pretty good. This is a view from the ground. That's our T-38 taking off. You can see it's afterburner. It has little afterburners, little engines. It became sort of a spectator sport in the Antelope Valley to watch the SR-71 to take off, because the first time we did a heavyweight takeoff, we went across Sierra Highway at 100 feet, and a lady in a station wagon nearly drove off the road, which was understandable. So we got in the habit of closing Sierra Highway when doing a heavyweight takeoff, and word got around so people would come out to watch. So as a result, this became a popular spectator sport in the 1980s to watch the SR take off. I took my daughter out here to watch it once, and she said, "It looks like a dragon." There's another view on here also taken from a highway. This is about a mile from the end of the runway, and you can see it's pretty spectacular too. What the plane looks like in daylight. And basically, like I said, it's a very impressive airplane. Our T-38 chase aircraft would stay with it up to about Mach 1.2, but then it would leave us in the dust, of course, as it went on. Nevertheless, we flew in the T-38 inside the Edwards area just so that we could clear for them, because often the guys inside the airplane were busy doing tests, etc., and we're not looking outside that much, so the T-38 would stay with them and basically watch out for them. So here we're actually still subsonic, although we're starting to accelerate. You can see that diffraction there. That's actually a shock wave. In the T-38, you could actually feel the shock wave off the SR-71. We stayed with it up to about Mach 1.2, and you can see it. Here we're subsonic now, and the SR-71 is refueling from the KC-135. So if you've never seen an aerial refueling, this is what it kind of looks like. The refueling aircraft maintains close formation with the tanker In the case of the SR-71, it took 15 to 20 minutes to refuel because we had an awful lot of gas. So basically you had to maintain tight formation about 30 feet under the tanker for 15 to 20 minutes, which sometimes could present its own challenges. The SR-71 pilot actually could not see the boom at all. What he's looking at is some lights on the belly of the tanker that tell him to move forward, move aft, move up, move down, which are controlled by the boom operator who's lying on his stomach in the belly of the tanker, basically controlling that boom during the refueling. This is a shot you do not usually see from underneath of a refueling. And people ask us because the SR-71 used special jet fuel that normal jet fuel would explode in the tanks because the airplane was so hot. We used a special fuel called JP7 that had a much higher ignition point. And it was a good thing we did because the airplane leaked. And people say, but when you got up to high speed and altitude, it stopped leaking. I said, no, I really doubt it. And this is kind of the proof here, because as we swing underneath, look at the underside of the airplane and you'll notice it's still wet. So yeah, when you're sitting on the ground, for instance, it looks like it's raining underneath the airplane, and it's actually fuel coming out of the tanks. So you can see the wet streak along the center line of the fuselage. Remember, everything after the pilots, etc., is a fuel tank. And the inboard wings are also fuel tanks. But since you're burning fuel at the rate of 1,000 pounds a minute in full afterburner, the leak rate doesn't really make much difference in terms of your range. This is actually at Norton Air Force Base, which is no longer an Air Force Base, of course. This is coming into land. That's just fuel vapor. We had a bad valve in our dump valve before. But the guy in the control tower asks me, he says, what is that? Fuel vapor? I said, yeah, it is. It's actually, we had a valve that we closed. That's usually where we dump fuel. And it hadn't closed properly, so we were seeping at certain angles of attack. But what I'm going to show here is when the airplane lands, a really big drag chute comes out to help it slow down. And the space shuttle basically has a drag chute now based on the SR-71. Because when the crew of the Discovery came out, when the Discovery was being built, a friend of mine was actually on the crew. So we took them all out to watch an SR-71 landing, and the astronaut pilot said, that's what the shuttle needs. He said, we need something that big. And after the loss of the Challenger, they installed a drag chute in it. That's a C-141. Like I say, Norton at the time was still an active Air Force base. But this is a lengthy thing that just shows the thing taxiing back. And the reason I kind of liked this shot is because of the sun angle through the shadow down on the ground. And you can see that the airplane really does look like a spaceship. And for those who go into San Bernardino Regional Airport, it used to be March Air Force Base. This was the 1984 Norton Air Force Base open house. Okay, and basically that's pretty much the end of the SR footage.
And you have a wonderful story to tell us about the SR-71. Can we close with that?
Yes. People sometimes say, what was the best thing about flying the SR-71 for 5 years? And I say, when I was a junior in college, they announced the existence of the Blackbird, and I could not believe that the United States could develop in secret an airplane that could cruise at Mach 3. I followed the airplane, what I could see about it throughout my entire Air Force career, and when I went through test pilot school in 1976, I actually got a guided tour of the cockpit by a NASA test pilot, Fitz Fulton, who's a good friend of mine now, by the way. But little did I think that within 4 years I would end up flying the airplane myself. To give you an idea, this airplane flies 4 times faster than virtually every other jet airplane in the world. So to actually end up flying an airplane at 85,000 feet, cruising at 2,000 miles an hour, and do it on a regular basis was literally a dream come true. Only about 250 people in the entire history of the program got to fly the airplane on a regular basis. So I just consider myself incredibly blessed to be lucky enough to be one of those guys.
What a dream job.
I'm not going to argue with that. And for those who haven't had enough airplane stuff at the Blackbird Air Park, I'd like to point out that next door to us and open the same hours as ourselves is the Joe Davies Heritage Air Park, sponsored by the city of Palmdale. This includes a collection of other historic aircraft, many of which have a connection with the Antelope Valley. Some of which I've actually flown myself too. So therefore, come on up to the Antelope Valley. You're going to get to see an awful lot of airplanes. As part of our tour of aerospace facilities in the Antelope Valley, I'd like to introduce our next host, Mr. Fred Johnson, who is director of the Air Force Flight Test Center Museum at Edwards Air Force Base. And he's going to basically provide you with a tour of the facilities we have here. Fred, take it over.
Thank you, Bill. This is the first flight wall. Every airplane on this wall completed part or all of its first flight here at Edwards. Some took off at the manufacturer's location and landed here. Others were shipped here in railroad cars or inside large transport aircraft and were assembled here and made their first flights. This is really a parade of aircraft technology from 1940 to the present. We're very proud that all of these airplanes made their first flights here. The airplane on the end cap, the artwork, depicts the YA-10B. That's a 2-seat version of the A-10 attack aircraft. Only one of those was ever built, and it flew here first also. And we have that airplane. It's out in front of the museum on display. We're very proud to have the only one ever built. The jet behind me is the YA-10B. It's the only 2-seat version of the A-10. The A-10 has been used for many years as a ground attack airplane. It's very rugged. It has redundant systems, which means if you lose one system, you have a backup for it. Very good ground attack, low-level airplane. The company decided to make a 2-seater for use in all-weather or night operations so that the backseat operator could be doing just the munitions, just the ordnance delivery. And the prototype worked very well. The Air Force decided not to go with it, so only one was ever built, and we have it here at the museum. This airplane is the XB-70. You can see it has 6 engine nozzles. This airplane with those 6 J-93 engines could fly faster than 2,000 miles an hour.
The XB-70 was originally conceived as a Mach 3 strategic bomber with an operational altitude of 70,000 feet. Only 2 experimental prototypes had been built by the time the Defense Department canceled the program. The large size of the XB-70 made it an ideal test bed for joint NASA-Air Force SST research.
And it was huge. To give you an idea of how large the airplane is, we have one of those 6 engines in the museum. This is just one of the engines of the 6-engined XB-70 that could fly faster than 2,000 miles an hour. On one flight, they ruined all 6 engines because that's the nature of test work. This is a very early F-16 2-seat test bed aircraft. This has been used at Edwards for many years for flight testing, and we acquired it for the museum after its test career was over. The F-16 will be rotated inside the museum so that we make room also for the prototype YF-22 jet fighter, which we will be receiving later this year. This is the full-size replica of the Bell X-1. This is the first aircraft to fly faster than the speed of sound in October of 1947.
The Air Force, with NACA support, conducted an accelerated test program with the first X-1 with the goal of quickly reaching Mach 1. The rocket-powered XS-1, later redesignated X-1, was carried aloft by a modified B-29. As the B-29 climbed to altitude, the XS-1 pilot entered the cockpit. On the historic day of October 14, 1947, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, seated in the XS-1 as it dropped away from the B-29, lit the rocket engines. As the plane accelerated, it pulled away from the P-80 chase plane, trailing a long white contrail. As the speed increased, the Mach meter needle passed 0.98, then suddenly jumped off scale, signifying supersonic flight. Captain Yeager had become the first person to break through the sound barrier, piloting the XS-1 to Mach 1.06. NACA flew the second X-1 in a more cautious step-by-step build-up program. Herbert Hoover, not the 31st president, became the first civilian NACA pilot to reach Mach 1 on March 4, 1948. Originally painted orange, the X-1s were repainted white for better tracking visibility against the blue sky. This remains the case even today for most research aircraft. The X-1 program laid the foundation for NACA's and later NASA's flight research.
We had a full-size replica constructed in 1997 for the 50th anniversary of supersonic flight. We took it on displays all over the U.S. and even to Mildenhall in England. This is the type of rocket engine that was used for early rocket flights, including the X-1, the first aircraft to fly faster than the speed of sound. They didn't know how to make rockets throttleable at that time, so it was either on or off. But the way they did that is you have 4 tubes, 4 chambers, and the pilot had the option to flip a switch to turn on 1, 2, 3, or 4 chambers. We made a display out of canopy sections from old F-4 fighters that I was able to find at a surplus yard in Utah, and took a lot of polishing to bring them back to life. And we're telling the story of supersonic flight in 6 panels in this display. And this was part of our traveling display in 1997 for the 50th anniversary. You'll notice behind me a copper .50 caliber bullet in the display. When they were designing the X-1 during World War II, nothing had ever flown supersonic, but they knew that .50 caliber bullets traveled at supersonic speeds. So they reasoned that if they shaped the fuselage of the X-1 similar to the shape of a .50 caliber bullet, it had a higher chance of remaining stable, and they were right. This is an ejection seat capsule from a B-58 Hustler bomber. If you're flying at faster than 1,000 miles an hour and you have an emergency and have no time to do anything but eject, you need protection from the slipstream at that speed. And the panels of this seat would drop down over the pilot like a suit of armor from A Knight in the Round Table and enable a safe ejection. To test this, the first living creature to survive a supersonic ejection was actually an anesthetized bear that was strapped into the seat, because the mass of the bear was similar to the mass of a human. And he did survive the flight, and that was all fine, although they say he was not very happy when he landed. This is the exhaust nozzle of the XLR-99 rocket engine. This is the ultimate rocket engine that powered the X-15 faster than Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound. The X-15 program is such a signature program from the golden age of flight test at Edwards. It will always be a very important part of our story.
As the quest for speed and altitude continued, the Air Force, Navy, and the NACA, later NASA, contracted with North American Aviation to build a new vehicle. This new vehicle, the X-15, would probe the hypersonic speed regime, that is, faster than Mach 5, and perform flight research at the edges of the Earth's atmosphere. With flights starting in 1959 and extending to 1968, it was and still is considered the most successful of all experimental research aircraft. The X-15 program added to the historic foundation of aerodynamics, sometimes measurably, often intangibly, in ways that were not imagined. It pushed the piloted records to an altitude of 67 miles and speed to Mach 6.7. 8 of the 12 X-15 pilots earned their astronaut wings. The X-15 provided much new insight into the once feared region of flight outside the atmosphere. It also gave engineers critical data on the unique challenge of re-entry. Re-entry compounds the effects of aerodynamics and spaceflight maneuvering and proved to be more demanding of both pilot and aircraft than anything encountered before. Many of the mysteries of re-entry flight were solved by the X-15.
One of the great advancements that the XLR-99 rocket engine brought to the table was it was finally throttleable. Now you could accelerate and decelerate with a throttle just like a jet engine or any other engine. We're fortunate to have 2 wind tunnel models from the X-15 program. They're made of stainless steel. They're very heavy and very rigid. They were required to make very specific measurements in wind tunnel testing before computers could do a lot of that work to predict how the X-15 would fly. What we're looking at now is a Cessna A37. This is a twin-jet trainer, later turned into an attack jet. In the white and orange markings, this is the way a lot of test and training airplanes are painted here at Edwards Air Force Base. This was used by the test pilot school to train new test pilots. And I understand some of you may already have seen some programming about Pancho Barnes. She had a fly-in, guest ranch, dairy, a number of things 5 miles west of where we are standing now. This is a door from Pancho Barnes' truck. She was quite a character from the Old West to the New West, and we are doing a lot of things with exhibitry for Pancho Barnes. We're exploring the possibility of a Pancho Barnes themed restaurant at our new location that we're developing. Lots of things revolve around Pancho. She was a character, much beloved, many stories to be told about her. We have an outside air park at the Air Force Flight Test Center Museum. We've got a large B-52 Stratofortress bomber. It's been in service since the 1950s. The last ones are still serving the Air Force today. A number of helicopters, a number of fixed-wing aircraft, all of which participated in flight test activities here at Edwards Air Force Base. We exist to share the museum with the public. We really like having visitors come to the museum. Ever since 9/11, it has been more difficult to get on military installations, but we do have public access available the first and third Fridays of every month. And if you would like to visit the museum at Edwards Air Force Base, you can call Edwards Public Affairs at 661-277-3517.
This is the area we call the Century Circle. It's located right outside the gate at Edwards Air Force Base. It represents those airplanes which were built in the 1950s and were the first supersonic fighter aircraft built for the United States Air Force. The orange structure you see amidst the airplanes is actually the original control tower from the Edwards Air Force Base of the 1950s. The tower was replaced by a much more modern structure in the 1980s, and the original tower, which was located on a framework much higher than this, was donated to the Edwards Museum. We thought this would be an appropriate place to place it on display to the Air Force amidst the airplanes that were its contemporaries. The first one is the F-100 Super Sabre, built basically in the early 1950s. It was designed to replace the F-86 Sabrejet, was designed to go supersonic in level flight, was actually used as late as the Vietnam War, and its biggest claim to fame is that it was the initial jet supersonic mount of the Air Force Thunderbird aerial demonstration team. They flew it for over 10 years, so millions of people saw the airplane in the Thunderbird markings. Next, we come to the F-101 Voodoo. The Voodoo was originally designed as an escort fighter for long-range jet bombers such as the B-47 and B-52. It turns out they decided that was really not a good idea, but the airframe was quite good, capable of supersonic speeds, so it was instead converted into an interceptor designed to protect the United States against the threat of Russian bombers in the 1950s and early 1960s. In addition, it was converted into a photo reconnaissance airplane and was used for its final missions in Vietnam as a reconnaissance aircraft. Next, we come to the F-102 Delta Dart. This was the first jet fighter that was designed with a delta wing without a conventional type tail. It was designed to go supersonic. Originally it would not go supersonic, and NASA had to come up with an area rule effect, which is sometimes called the Coke bottle effect, to reduce the drag on the airplane to the point where it could go supersonic. The particular F-102 you see here was used here at the Flight Test Center. It actually had two pilots instead of the normal one who were seated side by side, which accounts for the rather unusual shape and bulge of the nose. Next, we come to the F-104 Starfighter. This was built by Lockheed in the 1950s, was known as the missile with a man in it. Got a lot of publicity in Life magazine and in photos, but the test pilot, Tony Levere, when he first saw the airplane, said to Kelly Johnson, the designer, "Nice airplane, Kelly, but did you forget to put wings on it?" It's quite a small vehicle. Nevertheless, it was capable, even with just a single engine, of reaching Mach 2, the first jet fighter capable of doing that. It was equipped with two Sidewinder missiles and a 20-millimeter cannon. The German Air Force actually was one of the biggest users of it, as were a lot of foreign air forces, and they actually strapped a nuclear weapon on the underside of it in order to go on strike missions across the border into Eastern Europe. Next, we come to the F-105 Thunder Chief. This airplane is a considerably larger airplane than the F-104. It was intended to carry a single nuclear weapon in an internal bomb bay behind the pilot. The aircraft was designed to fly under the radar at very high speeds into basically Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In the event, fortunately, it never had to do that particular mission. Nevertheless, it was the mainstay of the initial strikes on North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The advantage it had was because it was so big, it could carry a lot of gas and a lot of bombs. So it was used to carry large payloads of bombs into the strikes against Hanoi. Finally, we come to the F-106 Delta Dagger. This is basically a relative of the F-102. Nevertheless, it was a quite different airplane, much more sophisticated aerodynamics. This airplane could reach Mach 2 and actually held the world's speed record of over 1,200 miles an hour for several years. It also was an interceptor piloted by a single pilot with a more sophisticated radar and carried air-to-air missiles inside internal weapons bays. Again, it was designed to protect the United States against the threats of Soviet bombers in the late 50s and early 60s.
This has been Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton.
And I'm Bill Flanagan.
I'll see you next time. We're here at NASA Dryden Research Center. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about the plane behind us here?